My nephew's behavioral problems at school were his only way of telling us his stepfather was hurting him at home. The principal called it escalating aggression when she handed me the incident report. 3 fights in 2 weeks, a broken window, a teacher's aide with scratches on her forearm. My nephew Caleb was 8 years old and weighed 52 pounds, and they were talking about him like he was a threat to public safety. I sat in that fluorescent lit office, staring at the words, immediate suspension, pending evaluation, while my sister sobbed into her hands and her husband rubbed her back with practiced concern. I remember thinking how strange it was that Caleb had been such a gentle kid just 6 months ago, the kind of boy who cried when he accidentally stepped on a caterpillar, the kind of boy who drew pictures of rainbows and gave them to strangers at the grocery store. Now they were describing him as volatile, dangerous, disturbed. I looked at my brother-in-law's face while the principal spoke, and something cold moved through my chest. His expression was perfect. Worried father, supportive spouse, baffled by his stepsons, sudden transformation, too perfect. The kind of performance you only recognize when you've spent years learning to read people who lie for a living. I'm a forensic interviewer. I've spent 11 years working with children who've experienced trauma, abuse, and things no child should ever have to name. I've sat in small rooms with tiny chairs and asked questions designed to unlock truths that adults have tried to bury. I know what trauma looks like when it wears a child's face, and I knew what I was seeing in my nephew even before I had proof. But knowing and proving are different countries, separated by oceans of bureaucracy, family loyalty, and the desperate human need to believe that monsters don't live in our own homes. My sister Danielle had married Graham 18 months earlier after a whirlwind courtship that made everyone uncomfortable except her. Graham had seemed like an answer to prayers. She'd stopped praying. Successful insurance adjuster, no criminal record, active in his church, coached youth basketball at the community center. He drove a spotless Subaru and remembered everyone's birthday. He called my mother Mom after knowing her for 3 months. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere. The first sign I noticed was at Thanksgiving dinner, about 4 months after the wedding. Caleb had always been a chatty kid that Thanksgiving. He barely spoke. When Graham asked him to pass the rolls, Caleb's hand trembled so violently that he knocked over his water glass. I watched Graham's jaw tighten for just a fraction of a second before he laughed it off and helped clean up the mess. Later, when I asked Caleb if he wanted to play video games in the den like we always did, he looked at Graham before answering, not at his mother, at Graham. Graham gave an almost imperceptible nod, and only then did Caleb say yes. I told myself. I was imagining things. I told myself that blended families were hard, that Caleb was probably just adjusting. I believed my own rationalizations for exactly 3 more months until Caleb started getting in trouble at school, and I couldn't look away anymore. The fight started in January. Caleb shoved a classmate during recess and wouldn't explain why. Then he threw a book at his teacher's head and spent 2 days in suspension. Then he bit another student hard enough to leave a mark that required a doctor's visit. Each incident seemed to come out of nowhere. His teacher sent home notes expressing concern about his sudden personality change and recommending psychological evaluation. Danielle and Graham took him to a child psychiatrist who diagnosed ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. After a single 45-minute session, they put him on medication that made him zombie-like and distant. I visited one Sunday afternoon and found him sitting on the living room couch, staring at nothing, his eyes flat and empty. When I said his name, it took him almost 5 seconds to turn his head toward me. I asked to see the bathroom and instead went to Caleb's room. The door was open, just a crack, and I pushed it wider without thinking. What I saw made my stomach drop. Through the floor, there was a lock on the outside of his bedroom door, a heavy-duty deadbolt, the kind you'd use on a front door, installed backward so it could only be locked from the hallway. I took a picture with my phone before I even processed what I was doing. 11 years of training kicking in, overriding the part of my brain that was screaming at me to confront Graham immediately. Document first, react later. I went to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and stared at my reflection until my hands stopped shaking. When I came back downstairs, I made small talk about work and weather, and I watched Graham's face. When Danielle went to the kitchen, his mask slipped. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as calculating, like he was trying to determine whether I was a threat. I left an hour later with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. In my car, I called my supervisor, told him about the lock, about Caleb's behavior changes, about the way he looked at Graham before answering questions. My supervisor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the words I already knew but needed to hear. You need to report this tonight. I called Child Protective Services at 8:47 that evening, gave them everything I had, which wasn't much. A photograph of a lock, behavioral changes at school, a gut feeling. The intake worker told me that a caseworker would be assigned within 72 hours. 72 hours. I sat in my dark car outside my apartment for 20 minutes trying to figure out what to do next. At 9:23, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was 3 words. He hurts me, then another. Don't tell mom, then a third. She won't believe. And that's when I realized everything was worse than I thought. Full story is linked below or on my channel.